Your call has been placed in conference.
We're so delighted today, Bearman of Bearman Consulting, who will be our presenter today. Before we get started, I wanted to just hand it over to Mike and ask if he might have any logistic overview that he would give for our webinar participants today. So welcome.
Had myself on mute there. Sorry about that. And my name is Michael Underhill with Associated Grantmakers. Thanks for joining us today. A few logistical things to address here today, and we will be having some pop-up questions throughout the webinar prompted by Jessica, our wonderful presenter today. So those will pop up right on your screen. Feel free to click those off, and there will also be some fill in the blank as well for your comments. If you have questions throughout the webinar, please feel free to enter them into the meeting stream on the left-hand side of your screen, and Jessica will be addressing those as she goes on, but we'll also have some time at the tail end of the presentation for questions. So please feel free to type those in as you go. And without further ado, I would like to hand it off to Jessica, who will be taking us through our webinar today.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Michael and Ramani. Excuse me. And welcome, everyone. It's great to be here with you. I'm Jessica Bearman. I'm going to show you what I look like. There, you should see me at the top of a Ferris wheel on your screen. Is that working? Have I successfully hijacked the controls, Michael? Oh, he's probably back on mute, but I'm going to assume that this is working. So great. Well, it's great to be with you again, and I am looking forward to being in Boston next week for the GEO conference. So in your fair city, I'm going to go ahead now. So I am really, as I said, really happy to be with you here today, in particular to talk about one of my favorite subjects, which is streaming the grant-making process. My career began in the nonprofit sector for about 10 years before I hopped the fence over to philanthropy. And this project, which I began working on fairly early in my time as a free agent, a consultant, it's an initiative of Grants Managers Network, GMN, in partnership with a lot of other organizations, both grant-making and grant-seeking focused, and it really exemplified that sort of intersection between funders and the nonprofit sector and how everyone can be sort of best, most constructive partners. So it really worked for me. For a long time, I've maintained that our current system of application and reporting is what I think of as an effectiveness paradox, which is that grant makers, in our justified desire to be really effective stewards and responsible stewards of our resources, can also sort of inadvertently undermine the effectiveness of nonprofit partners, and in some ways really our own effectiveness as well through our burdensome and unnecessary practices. So Project Streamline was designed really as a way to address that. And when I think about Project Streamline, I think people tend to think of its impact, of the impact of application and reporting on grantees and grant seekers, but in fact there's quite an impact internally in foundations also when practices are sort of cumbersome and onerous. And one of the impacts is that funders can't spend time the way they want to spend time. So I like this slide to sort of illustrate that. And I would ask you all just for a second as we're getting going to think a little bit about some of the bureaucratic demands of your grant making and whether you have in mind a particular example of a silly thing that you've ever had to do for a grant maker, maybe as a grant seeker, or something that an organization that you've been part of has asked of its nonprofit partners that struck you as perhaps redundant or burdensome. Let me just give you a second to think about that, and if you have anything in mind, you can either pipe up or you can type it into the chat box. We'll see how that chat box is working. any particularly silly practices or unnecessary practices that come to mind? Well, keep thinking. I'll just share with you that recently I was developing a proposal for my kids' school, my children's school, and it was for a fairly small grant, certainly under $10,000, and it must have taken about 200 hours all told to put together, it felt like, between me and the other people working on it. It ended up having to be submitted in a binder with tabs, actually 3 binders with tabs, and everything sort of collated and hole punched, but not stapled, and with a certain margin size. And I kept thinking, I am going to let them have it because I am Dr. Streamline. I'm going to write them some serious feedback. And then we got the grant, and I have to say that my my desire to provide feedback was greatly reduced, and the urgency went away. And I think that that's just an important thing for all of us to remember, that there's real power when you get the money. You may not be any longer compelled to complain about the process, even when the process was really onerous. So what we're going to talk about is just a little bit of an overview of Project Streamline and streamlining. I want to share with you what we've learned through 2 rounds of research in terms of the issue itself and that matter most for grant seekers. We will close, as Mike said, we'll have conversation throughout. If you have questions or comments, I'm happy to take. And I want to be sure that you leave with resources that you can access and use, and then some extra time for discussion and questions at the end. Oops, I went backward. There we go. So I do want to begin by just learning a little bit about who is on the line. So I'm going to launch this first poll if I can effectively do it. And this poll asks you about your role. Are you an executive director, a vice president, or senior staff person, program officer? Are you on the grants management side, whatever your title? And then also, are you on a nonprofit board currently? Did you used to work for a nonprofit? So you should be able to respond with more than one thing. So feel free to chime in whatever your current or past role or affiliation. Great. 9 of 12. This is very efficient. And we'll just give that one more second. All participants have responded. Awesome. So when I save results and close, whoop, it went away. Is there a way to get that back?
Yes, it's located in the meeting stream.
Oh yeah, okay, great. So everyone should be able to see those results. Thank you, Mike. So it looks like we've got a contingent of folks who do grants management, people who are program officers or senior staff. Many of you, or several of you, used to work for a nonprofit or are on a nonprofit board, and then some other folks as well, including a trustee, consultant, administrative assistant. Great. And I'm guessing that some of you may play multiple roles. So whatever your role, it's great to have you here. I think people who have worked for a nonprofit or on a nonprofit board have a particular sort of empathy around these issues, but any of us who've been working in this sector and care about making change, I think are interested in how we can do so in the in the least burdensome but most effective way. So let me ask you another question, which is, to what extent are you familiar with streamlining and Project Streamline? And this will help me to know how much detail to give you. We've got some what streamlining and some slightlys. Great. Looks like a range. Terrific. So just a few people who are very or moderately familiar, and some slightly and some wet streamlining. So I will try to gear my comments so that a range of interest levels and knowledge levels can be addressed. So I'm going to save this and into the programs or into the webinar stream as well. And final question for now, which is just another chance to chime in with some burning questions, although you'll have a chance later as well. So this is just an open comment box. If you know that you've got a question that you'd like to have answered during this webinar, please feel free to enter it, but you can always ask questions in the chat box as well. So we'll just leave this up for 1 minute. Okay, I'm going to close it in 3 seconds. So if you are, entering a comment, what is it and how will it make us better? I will definitely try to answer that one. Thank you. Great. Oh, excellent question. Can you all see these on your screen as well as they pop up?
Yes.
Okay.
I can.
Okay. So what is it and how will it make us better? Are budgets really necessary? The balance between questions on the application and follow-up through conversation, and streamlining is best practice for a grant seeker. Great. Terrific questions. I'm going to go ahead and save these results and close, but again, feel free to enter other questions in the chat box. All right. So without further ado, what is streamlining? Project Streamline and sort of the whole idea of streamlining, which I will define in a moment, kind of begins with a basic premise, which is that your practices as a grant maker are the thing that the community sees. So you may have a lot of really deep and compassionate values and principles and vision, but it's your practices that are actually visible to the community. And when those practices are not aligned with your values, then there's sort of that misalignment can cause problems internally and externally. Project Streamline's basic premise is that grant seekers are devoting too much time to seeking funding and reporting on grants, and that can be to the detriment of their mission-based work. The Project Streamline, as some of you have known for a long time, began in 2007 with the publication of a report that I wrote called Drowning in Paperwork, Distracted from Purpose. And as I mentioned earlier, the work is led by the Grants Managers Network with many collaborators, including Exponent Philanthropy, the regional associations of grantmakers, grantmakers prospective organizations, the Foundation Center, the Association of Fundraising Professionals, and others. So it was really a consortium. And the real goal is to raise the awareness of funders so that we don't have money going down the drain on the grant making or grant seeking side of things. And we really are very interested in helping everyone to use their time as wisely as possible. We want to help grant makers understand, and then to whatever extent it makes sense, reduce the burden of application and reporting. And this last part of the sentence is really important, while still getting the information that you need to make good decisions. I believe that when Project Streamline started, we were more focused on the grantee experience. As I have continued to do this work over the last, almost 10 years, I've really started to feel like, yes, it is really important to think about the grantee experience, but it's equally important to think about what you want to accomplish as a grant maker and how you're using your time so that your time and resources are going toward the mission-based work that you most want to support. You're not probably interested in your funds and the other funds from the sector going to support your grantee making 15 collated copies. More important that you support their work running after-school programs or, restoring the environment or whatever your passion is. So that is what Project Streamline is all about. In the first report, Drowning in Paperwork, Distracted from Purpose, we investigated via surveys, anonymous surveys and interviews and focus groups, what sort of the state of the field was. And some of these things have changed, but I think a lot of them still stand. And we really laid out the issue in the form of these 10 flaws in the system of grant making. So you've probably seen these issues in your work. You can certainly read about them from Drowning in Paperwork, which is available through GMN, probably through your regional association as well. But there are a few that I really want to highlight, and I'll be happy to answer questions about any of the others. The 10 flaws in the system which really kind of trap us all. The first that I just really want to point to is the enormous variability in the system. So anytime a grant seeker approaches a grant maker, a foundation or other funder, they encounter a whole different set of requirements, a whole different set of timeline expectations. You may or may not have a letter of inquiry. You may or may not have an eligibility quiz. You may or may not have a site visit. The grant period may or may not align with the period for your project. You might have one report. You might have 4 reports due annually. So there's just a huge amount of variability. And I've tried to bring in the grantee voice in this PowerPoint as much as possible. One commented that reporting alone varies so widely, and it doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. That one funder wanted a monthly report for a very small grant. That's quite unusual. Whereas another just wanted one final report at the end of a $50,000 grant. So as a grant seeker, you're always encountering this variability and needing to adjust to it. I want to talk about the second and third flaws in the system, the lack of right sizing, and this idea of the net grant. So right sizing is the idea that requirements should be congruent with the size of the grant and the type of grant and the previous relationship with the grant seeker. And so often, not always, but often, a small grant you would expect to have a smaller set of requirements, perhaps a shorter application, perhaps less in the way of reporting and monitoring. That's not always the case. There are some times that it makes sense to do more, even for a small grant. Similarly, if you've been funding the same organization for 15 years and intend to continue funding them, you might not need the same set of information from them each year. You might want to ask them different types of questions, or you might have a greatly streamlined renewal process because mainly you want to support their work and you want them to be devoting their energies to their work. And the sort of corresponding idea of net grants is important. Net grants are, that's what I call the amount of money that's left over after the cost of applying for and reporting on the funds has been taken into consideration. So, for example, if a grant is small, only $5,000, but it takes 16 hours to prepare the grant and 8 to report on it, then the amount of money sort of technically left over is less than what was given. And this is an issue for small grants. It's less of an issue for large grants, but what I believe, just in general, is that funders should be very cognizant of the time it takes to apply for and report on their grant so that you can make really thoughtful decisions about whether that's acceptable to you or not. And you might decide it is. Let me move on just to another idea that I have really been taken with lately, which is that there's a cost, obviously, to each grant seeker and grantee for applying for your funds. But there's also a cost to the sector, particularly when grants are competitive and require, a full application, or there's a more general RFP, and you perhaps receive 100 full proposals and only fund 20 of them. In that case, then there's a cost to the sector that I just think grant makers should again be cognizant of, so that you can make smart decisions about the extent to which that works for you. And so in this sort of hypothetical example, there's a $160,000 cost to the sector, and many of those applicants are not receiving any funds at all. So those are just some of the ideas that I think that grant makers just want to be aware of and take into consideration as you're developing your program. Another really key flaw in the system that we kind of uncovered in the first round of research is this idea of the outsourced burden. And the way I think about this is that there is absolutely a burden to applying for and receiving funds, and there should be. You know, I don't believe that anyone should stand on the street corner and hand out money, although, you know, someone could certainly argue that that would that would be a very streamlined form of grant making. You know, the grant makers do need to exercise good stewardship and good due diligence, and so there's a burden, and that burden can take the form of administration. It can have to do with who makes those photocopies for the trustees, or for whom does the online system work well. It can also take the form of evaluation data. Often grant makers will want to see, you know, whether their portfolio is making a difference, and so they'll ask their grantees to collect certain data and report on certain data. And when that data may or may not be information that is of interest to the grant seeker. And so, you know, I would think of that as, you know, that's a burden that the grant maker is sort of outsourcing to its grant seekers. And I think that there's a certain balance to be struck here. You know, some things are obviously the grant seeker's job to take care of, but I think it's a good idea for grant makers always to ask themselves, you know, what is the burden to this part of our application and reporting, and might we be able to take some of it on ourselves? So who gets to choose the format for the budget and financial information? Who's responsible for that evaluation data if the funder is the one who wants to use it?
Hi, Jessica. I think we have lost your audio. So if you don't mind trying to reconnect to that, and we will connect you back as quickly as possible. And Jessica, if you could also just let us know you could hear us in the stream. It looks like we've lost everyone. Experiencing audio issues. Hi folks, I'm just checking out to see the audio. If you can hear me, please enter your message into the chat box. Okay. I am going to try to connect the okay, looks like folks I can hear. So Jessica, if you wouldn't mind trying to call back in, and we will. Thank you, Jessica. Sorry everyone for the okay. We're going to try and get Jessica to call back in. See if we can get her on the line. Apologies, everyone. Start the meeting. Jessica start sharing. Just 1 minute here.
Hello?
Hi, Jessica.
So odd.
So odd. I believe you can hear me. I'm just going to check in with everyone.
Now I can hear you, yeah.
Okay, great. I can hear you great on the line here. Janet's checking in. She can hear us.
Oh, great. Ruth can hear. Okay.
Back online, everybody.
That was so weird. I couldn't hear anyone either. Well, my apologies, everyone, but now that we've been through this together, we'll be friends for life.
I'll let you take it away, Jessica.
Okay, great. I'll just keep on going. Thanks, everyone, for chiming in right away when you couldn't hear. I really appreciate that, and I apologize. All right. Assuming you can still hear me, I'm just going to keep right on going. So again, the 10 flaws in the system, I think a lot of the others are fairly self-explanatory. I'm happy to answer questions about any of them as we go. Maybe just a couple of comments on them. The sort of idea of trust is important. I think a lot of funders have a real core value around trust, as I mentioned earlier, yet their processes don't actually demonstrate any level of trust in their grant seekers, which is not to say that you should hand out money on the street corner, but again, just to be asking that question. Number 6, the reports on the shelf, I think is really acute. I talk to funders all the time that say that they don't have time to really thoroughly read and digest the reports that they receive, and also that even when they do, they're doing it mainly for accountability purposes, maybe for some internal learning, but that those reports don't contribute to sort of a larger field building. They don't necessarily form the basis for ongoing conversations with the individual grantee or with the sort of field of grantees, and they're just not being taken advantage to their full potential. Grant makers have an enormous stash of knowledge and wisdom and information in those reports, and they do all too often end up on a shelf. So from these 10 flaws in the system, which you can learn more about in Drowning in Paperwork, Distracted from Purpose, Project Streamline came up with 4 sort of basic core principles. And I think of this as sort of your streamlining hat. If you've got these things in mind, then you will make sensible changes and develop your application and reporting in ways that are sensible for your own organization. There's really no one-size-fits-all. When I started Project Streamline with the Grants Managers Network, there was, I think, an idea that we might be able to just identify some basic, standards for how everybody should do things and just roll them out to the field and everyone would rush to adopt them. But surprisingly, that didn't happen. And so instead, I think we operate more at this level of, here are these basic principles that you can have in mind. And then from that, we have a set of, very concrete and specific changes that we recommend. But what you take on will really depend on your organization and what you're trying to achieve. So when you put on your streamlining hat, the 4 principles to have in mind are, number 1, take a look again at what you're requiring. And that can be an application and reporting, and there are a set of questions that I think are really helpful to ask. And the first is, do we really use this piece of information to make decisions? And often there are sort of barnacles on your application, I find. Things that have always been there, things that have been added over time because someone was interested, or things that you might be asking because occasionally it's important information, but not always. And so I recommend really going through and saying, for each question you ask, do we use the answer to this question almost all the time? Do we use it to make decisions? And if not, then I think a second question to ask, or if so, rather, then a second question to ask is there another way we can get this information? So, a really simple example is having the IRS letter of determination on file is something that a lot of grant makers still do and often do annually, even for repeat grantees. And that's something that, to really understand tax status, as you all know, you need to verify it anyway. And so really having one copy of the letter of determination is plenty sufficient. And in fact, you don't even really need one copy in the file legally. but you do need to have done that verification that the organization is eligible. And so, that's just a very small thing, but just a piece where it's something that goes in the file each year, but may not actually be necessary. I've been working with a funder recently who they always ask a set of questions about relationships with other organizations, and they found that they almost never consider that in the first round of decisions. It's only when they're really, looking at their sort of finalists that they use that information. So they decided to take that out of the letter of inquiry and move it into the full application, where only the grant seekers with the best chance of getting funded are completing that question, because it was a more nuanced question from their perspective, not one where they needed the information from everyone. The second core principle is to right-size expectations and be sure that your net grant is as high as it can be, and that you feel that the expectations for the grant seeker are really well aligned with the size of the grant and the type of grant. An application for a general operating support grant will probably be different. Those requirements will be different from the requirements for a project grant, will be different from a capital grant. Again, the requirements for a grantee that you're just meeting for the very first time are going to be different from an organization that you've been funding for 15 years and intend to fund for another 15 years. Thirdly, and we talked about this earlier, to relieve the burden in whatever ways make sense. So to always be asking that question, what is the burden? Do we actually understand the burden here? Because no one's just going to volunteer that information. Do you understand the burden? And then are there ways that we as a grant maker can relieve the burden? And then finally, this one seems so sort of self-explanatory and like a forehead slapper, but it's really important that the communication that you're offering to the field be straightforward and clear. And that's a streamlining. It's a streamlining practice, because the more clear your funding priorities are, the fewer ill-fitting requests you will get. The more consistent your communication, on the web and in printed material, and when someone calls and talks to a staff person, the more consistent that is, the more sort of effectively grant seekers will be able to apply for your funds. And not surprisingly, communication is, it's often inconsistent, between those different platforms. It can be very inconsistent in terms of timing. Sometimes grantees wait a long time to know where their application is in a process. And then finally, communication is often not two-way. So grant makers put out a lot of information, but they're not getting a lot of information back from grantees. And so all of these challenges, I think, for streamlining exist because we've put things in place in the past to solve yesterday's problems. So as Peter Senge says, today's problems are yesterday's solutions. So it's, you may have a lot of extra questions on your application, or you may have a particular kind of budget template because in the past it made sense. But I think the sort of regular scrubbing of your requirements is just a useful practice. I know it can be hard to find the time. And one of the biggest problems that grant makers face is that they don't get a lot of detailed and honest feedback from their grantees. And the reason for that is depicted in my little slide here. Just like my little story at the beginning, it's scary for a grantee, no matter how good and strong their relationship with the grant maker is. It can still be scary to provide constructive or negative feedback about your grant maker's practices. When I did the last piece of Project Streamline research, which is called Practices That Matter, we learned that more than half of grant makers hadn't even considered adding a way to get candid feedback. Or they'd rejected that idea. And 41% of grant seekers, so nonprofits, told us that they had never had a funder ask for feedback. Never, never, never in all of their funders. So I think it's still a practice that is less common, perhaps, than it should be. And to that end, I wanted to do another quick anonymous poll which is how do you seek feedback from your grantees, specifically about your application and reporting practices. How do you find out how those practices are working for your grantees? And your options are, we don't do it at this point. We do it in informal conversation, so maybe, when you're checking in with them, you hear. We do it as part of the application or report, so maybe at the end of the application, some people will have a question, please comment on this application. How was it for you? Do you do interviews or focus groups? Do you yourself use an anonymous survey, or do you work with a third-party consultant like CEP or another consultant? And I don't know whether this one was set up for multiple responses or not, but if so, feel free to respond and tell me all the different ways that you seek feedback. This is always so really interesting. So it looks like we've got a real variety here, with some of you not seeking feedback at all at this time, or just doing it in informal conversation, or doing it in informal conversation in addition to doing it in another way. Great, just waiting on a couple more responses. All right, I'm going to save and close, save this, and it will be saved to the webinar stream. Bing. It's like magic. So just to take a quick look at those results, again, a variety of ways, including not seeking feedback at this time, or doing it as part of the application or report. So it's I would maintain that when you're asking for feedback about the process as part of the process and it's not anonymous, you may get some, but you may not get quite as honest and right feedback as you would in an anonymous survey. I certainly think it's always good to ask in informal conversation or via an interview or focus group, and just to be aware of that power dynamic that you have as the funder. You may not get everything you want from the grant seeker unless you're very specific and providing a safe space when there's no funding on the line. I had one funder in a quote say to me, I would never, ever give candid feedback to my funders unless I never planned to go back to them for additional funding, which, I think is not at all the way funders want it. So now I just want to transition to the second piece of research and what we learned about what matters most to grant seekers. So as you're thinking about where to really focus your streamlining, or perhaps you're already very streamlined, these are the things that grantees, we surveyed grantees in the field and ended up hearing from about 500 of them to answer these questions. And these are the things that matter most in terms of their time and effort and ability to do a good job with their work. The first is that they want online systems that really work well. And a number of you, I believe, have an online system, I would imagine. And the online systems are, I think, a big improvement from having to submit hard copy in a lot of ways. And I think that, almost all grantees now have access to the internet and have access to computers. 10 years ago, that wasn't the case, but now it really is. And so most grant makers, I believe in my research, something like, 80-some% had moved to online systems, and that was really just a kind of a sea change across the sector. But what's important about the online systems is that when they're poorly designed and not user-tested, they really can be even more burdensome than receiving hard copies in the mail. And so I'm not saying you should go back to the hard copies, but I do believe that it's our responsibility as funders to really user test those online systems and make sure that they're not doing things that any one of us would really detest. For example, timing people out and not saving their work, or not allowing you to see all of the questions that are going to be on the application before you begin, not allowing people to cut and paste from Word, having sort of mysterious character limits where you're typing along and then suddenly you're out of characters and you have to go back and try to, use shorter words, or use contractions. That's, again, the kind of thing that none of us want our grantees to be doing for us, but our online systems often have that impact. And so I think it's really important that we all go through our online system, force ourselves to do it, do some user testing when you're moving into an online system, and make sure that system really works from a customer service perspective. Secondly, grant seekers really want funders to accept budget and financial reports in their own format. And what I'll say about that is that, I totally understand why we use templates. It is a lot easier on the funder, particularly if you're working with small grassroots organizations that might not have very good budgeting and financial systems. But many nonprofits have good ways that they do their accounting and their budgeting. And when we force them to slice and dice those numbers into our detailed templates, we make it very difficult. The potential for error is much greater. The time cost is much greater. And I believe it really masks capacity issues as well in the nonprofit. So if your nonprofits that you're funding can't put together a good budget or a financial report, that's a capacity issue that we might want to address as funders. But simply having them put their information into a detailed template may not be the right way to do it. When funders do have templates, grantees prefer, not surprisingly, that they have very few categories and that they be flexible enough to allow for the various ways that grant seekers generally account for their funds. Now, earlier in this call, somebody asked, is the budget really necessary? And I'm really excited about that question. I did some work in the last year with a woman named Carol Cantwell, whose organization Fund with Financials works with nonprofits and funders around budget information. And she is on a crusade to get funders to simply drop the budget altogether, which I know seems really radical. But her point is that you don't learn that much from a budget that you get in an application, which somehow miraculously always zeroes out and everything always adds up. And if you're really interested in understanding the financial sort of status and capability of an organization, there are other ways to do that. So for more on that, I'll send Ramani and Mike a blog post and some other information about dropping the budget, so if anyone's interested in taking that radical step. The third practice that really matters is clear two-way communications. And I feel like I've probably been on my soapbox enough about this. I'll just, reiterate that seeking feedback about your practices is the only way you're going to know their impact. And having that sort of conversation is really important to grantees as well. They really want, no surprise, a relationship with their funders. They will be willing to share detailed and concrete feedback with you about how it's working for them, but they need to be asked in a way that doesn't feel like it's jeopardizing funding. Grantees also ask that their funders filter with a brief letter of inquiry or a conversation or an eligibility quiz or something. So if you think back to that slide I had where I was showing the cost to the sector of an open RFP, you can start to see why it's really useful to have some mechanism so that not everybody completes the full application. And maybe none of you do that. But a lot of funders do. They'll get 80 proposals, full proposals with full budgets and board lists and 3 years of audited financials and, et cetera. And then they fund, just a small percentage of them. And that really is, I believe, a waste of everyone's time. And so Project Streamline really advocates a filtering, and that can be with a conversation. They might just have to talk to you before they apply, before they get that link to the full application. You can use a letter of inquiry. There are other creative ways that other funders have chosen to do this, including just inviting proposals, which, obviously puts more work on the funder to identify those good partners, but certainly means that the application process is a good use of the grant seeker's time. And then finally, right-sized practices, which I know I've talked your ear off about already. Somebody asked earlier about reporting and the sort of balance between, let me find the question again, written reporting, I believe, and sort of a conversation. And I guess that was actually a balance of questions on application and follow-up through conversation. And I think that balance in both application and reporting really, it really has to do with your intent as a funder. But since most funders are really interested in knowing and building relationships with and building the capacity of their grantees, I think if you can set up a process that does allow for more conversation, ultimately that's really ideal. Particularly if those conversations are documented in a way that becomes part of the record, part of that grantee's record and part of the portfolio and part of your ongoing learning. There is no requirement, as you probably know, for a grant maker to get reports, at least if you're funding a 501c3 organization. So reports are something that we're choosing to do, and one of the things that I've really been thinking about a lot lately is just that the extent to which funders can be really clear and intentional about why they're requiring a report. Because a report that's purely for accountability, did you do what you said you were going to do with the money, is a really different kind of report than a report that is for learning or a report that is intended to build the field. And so I think it's important just to know why you're requiring a report and then let the frequency and content of reporting really cascade from that intention. Project Streamline's our preference or our guideline is that reports really should be annual, unless you have a particular reason to feel that the project or grantee is risky. But that an annual report, perhaps supplemented by halfway through the year a conversation or a very brief check-in, should be sufficient for most grants. Again, that's me talking with my streamlining hat on. Project Streamline has a number of guides, and one of them is called Making Streamlining Stick. And among the things that Making Streamlining Stick does is it lays out sort of a process for streamlining. So I just want to show this to you so that you'll be familiar with it if you see it again. But it really describes a process that a lot of funders that I've talked with have used to go about really examining and understanding their current state, mapping their current process, understanding what the cost is internally and externally, making the case for change, planning changes, and then implementing a streamlining process. So I hope that you'll all check that out if you're interested in continuing the sort of streamlining journey. And then finally, I just want to show you some additional resources that Project Streamline has available. And these are all through the Grant Managers Network website. It's not, I believe you can still get there at projectstreamline.org, but it may even be simpler to get there through the GMN website. There's a Project Streamline tab. Over the last 6 months, Project Streamline, which had its sort of own had more of its own identity, has been better interwoven into the fabric of what Grants Managers Network does, which is really terrific, I think, both for Project Streamline and for GMN. But among the things you'll find there are research reports. There's this whole guide to streamlining, which has a lot of concrete tips on budgeting, on budgets, on online reporting, on due diligence, and on right sizing, all of the aspects of streamlining we've been talking about. I have a blog that is just about monthly at this point, but you can always ask a question to Dr. Streamline. And then you can also find self-assessment tool and various cost audits and sample surveys on that site. So I hope that you'll check it out when you get a chance. And then finally, I'd love to have any questions or comments from the group. Hi, Michael.
Jessica, it's Janet. Can I ask a question?
Hi, Janet. Nice to see you. Yes, of course.
Yeah, I've loved this work over the years and followed it, and yet the logic of it is just so clear to me. And yet being a trustee of a foundation where I'm trying to communicate this, there's a real disconnect between this logic and kind of the, and I just am wondering if you've had any sort of breakthroughs with folks, because those barnacles are pretty, you know, they're pretty tight on there.
Right,
and,
they can be hard to scrape off.
So I just love any examples that you have of what was the tipping point for, you know, and you know, I just got off of a call with a grants committee that, you know, turned themselves wrong side out to try to do good grant making, and I just, so anyway, it just seems to be a disconnect. So I don't know what the tipping point is, because I think you're right that grantees are not going to be
forthright. Yeah. So, I mean, I think that's such an important question, Janet. I mean, one thing that I have certainly found is that trustees especially don't see the sausage being made often, unless it's a real working board. But
and
often,
they haven't worked for nonprofits. I think you're right. I think if you run a nonprofit,
then you have
apply for grants and you have a different perspective. So go ahead.
Often, although boy, you get into the funding role and you can sort of forget the pain. But
I know.
but you know, I think sometimes it's just really important that as staff in foundations, we help our trustees to understand the actual impact of the process, because by the time it reaches the board, this has certainly been my experience, by the time it reaches the board, it looks pretty streamlined. It's in a binder, or it's on your iPad, or you're reading a summary, and again, no one ever complains. And so it can be very hard, I think, to understand the process, and you don't necessarily want to take your trustees that deeply into the weeds either. So I have certainly heard of foundation staff doing things like, you know, bringing all the stacks into the meeting and thunking them down, you know, and then showing, you know, taking people on a little walk through the process in kind of a humorous way. I think it's important for trustees to know that they're not going to be shirking on their stewardship duty. So I think to be able to benchmark and show, you know, that there are other funders that do things differently, and it works just fine and nobody goes to jail, I think can also be a really important point to make to trustees. Ultimately, I think bringing that grantee voice in is in some ways the most powerful. Most people, you know, are in philanthropy because they want to make a difference to the issues that they care about, and I think just helping boards understand, boards and leadership sometimes in foundations understand the extent to which grantees could be even more effective in their work if they weren't as burdened, and the extent to which staff internally could be spending time on more meaningful activities if they weren't so burdened, can be effective. But I know that's a tough one. That is a tough one, so maybe others have good suggestions there. Anyone? Well, while you're thinking, Michael has chimed in with another question, which is, do I find that different types of grant makers have different priorities within the streamlining process? That's a great question, you know, and I think that types of the type of grant maker you are really does matter in that, for example, if you're a community foundation, one of your priorities is engaging your community stakeholders, you know, your reviewers, your board. And so you may be asking questions as part of the application or as part of reporting that are really designed in part to engage those stakeholders. You also have more people that you need to convince that a piece of information is not required or not required of everyone. You have more sort of priorities in the mix. So I think there can be special challenges for family foundations that are engaging family stakeholders, or community foundations that are engaging community stakeholders. But again, I think that most people can kind of get this idea that, you know, ultimately we need enough information to be responsible and to make good decisions, but we don't necessarily need all the information at the same time from everyone, and we don't necessarily need it all. There may be things that we're not actually using. Any other questions or comments?
Well, I don't want to dominate, Jessica, but I'm curious, too, what Project Streamlining is saying about common grant applications. That are those just complete dinosaurs, and I mean, it was intended to help applicants, but unless everybody used it, it didn't. So.
Right. So way back on that 10 flaws slide, if you all remember, the Common Grant application was one of what I call the double-edged sword, and that's because it just seemed to make so much sense, and I know about 15 years ago, a lot of the regional associations, maybe all, created them in very comprehensive processes with their grant makers. And unfortunately, what the research found was that most grant makers are not using them. We're not using them, or we're using them in addition to their own 10 questions, or we're using them but saying, well, you can use that, but we really prefer this other set of questions, so, grantees weren't going for it. I think what is more promising that I'm seeing on the horizon are data repositories like Simplify, which GuideStar and the Foundation Center have been developing, where certain key information is stored there for anyone to access, so that grantees maybe only need to enter their board list once, right, and then any funder can go get it. That would save time and work. And then I think another just sort of promising thing on the horizon would be kind of question repositories. So if a regional association could develop a set of different ways to ask, or, a set of sort of recommended ways to ask very common questions, so that grant makers were not asking for, your project plan in 7 different ways, but there was just one basic way to ask for it. That could be helpful. But I don't see the common application, at least as it existed previously.
Well, I didn't know if the common application, a common report form, that if there were open-ended set of questions that, like.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I think there's promise there, but it would have to be something online at this point.
Yeah.
Let me just raise the question that Erica just asked, which is how do you maintain fairness in the process of if different levels of grantees are asked for different types of information? And I think that, that's that grant makers struggle with. But I guess I would maintain that you may not ever really be able to compare apples and apples. And that, you may have a set of renewal grants that are being asked consistent information, or you may have a consistent set of information that you're asking to your small grant program, but that it may not actually be entirely fair. I'm not sure I'm not sure how to think about fairness in this context. I think what you want to do is ask questions that get you the information that you really need to know in order to make a good decision about a grant. And it may be slightly different information of grants and different types of grantees. But that's a longer question, Erica, and I think I feel like I don't really have time to do it justice, so maybe we'll talk about that next time. And finally, Ramani's question, how does a funder reconcile a grant that's clearly written by an outside grant writer versus a grant that's not well written but there's a clear need? Oh, my goodness. We're out of time, Ramani. I'm afraid
I thought I'd slip that in.
That is a great question, and I think that's part of why having those actual conversations is so important. Maybe having a process with a letter of inquiry or something that then allows you to focus more energy and attention on some of the grant seekers whose projects you feel are really good fit, and maybe they need some help with that grant writing capacity. Because, I think that's a common issue that comes up. All right. We are out of time, and I have so appreciated this opportunity to talk with all of you. I want to turn it back over to you, Ramani and Michael, for any final words or comments.
I just want to say thank you so much, Jessica, and all of you. I just want to do a quick reminder. I know folks have left, but we have our upcoming annual meeting for Associated Grantmakers, and we want to invite those who haven't already signed up to please join us. So it's going to be June 17th, and our keynote speaker is Governor Charlie Baker. And it's at the State Street Pavilion, Fenway Park. So it should be a great time and wonderful speakers that we have lined up. So please join us and sign up if you haven't already. And thanks again, Jessica.
Thank you.
I want to thank Michael, too, for all of his work on putting this webinar together. So thank you all for joining us. Have a great afternoon.
Take care, everybody. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.